During Redcloud War, when the warriors ran into the breech-loading trapdoors for the first time, Chief Redcloud called them guns that talk much. This here is a Pedersoli reproduction of the 1873 Springfield Trapdoor. The 1873 Trapdoor was primarily issued in both carbine length 22-inch barrels for mounted troops, like this one, and also a full-length rifle model with a 30-inch barrel for the infantry. Both were chambered in 4570 government, cartridge that still sees some use by hunters today. The 1873 model was the first firearm for the U.S. Army manufactured in that 4570 caliber. That's not to say it was the first trapdoor firearm used by the Army. At the close of the Civil War, the Ordnance Department had a whole bunch of 1861 and 1863 muzzle-loading rifled muskets, but not a whole bunch of money left in the budget after the war. What they did have was Erskine Allen of Springfield Armory. He developed a method for converting existing muzzle-loading rifles into breech loaders by adding a hinged trapdoor mechanism. These were known as the Allen conversion. The first Allen conversion of the Civil War 58 caliber muzzle loaders were produced in 1865. Those models kept the 58 caliber bore and used a rimfire cartridge. The second conversion was an improved design, designated the model of 1866. On the second model, the trapdoor mechanism was strengthened, and the barrels were sleeved or rebarreled for the 5070 government, the first centerfire cartridge U.S. service round. For the most part, it was the second conversion that the troops in the field began receiving in 1867. For a more complete rundown of the trapdoor models and their evolution, check out the 11 Bang Bang channel. I'll put something in the show notes for that. A series of battles, what's now known as Redcloud War, occurred from 1866 to 1868. It involved Northern Plains tribes, mainly Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, fighting to protect their land in what's now Wyoming and Montana from gold seekers from the U.S. In 1863, gold was discovered in Montana's Alder Gulch. To reach it, settlers needed a shortcut, and the Bozeman Trail was scouted. First scouted by John Bozeman and John Jacobs in 1863, the trail cut directly through the heart of the Powder River Basin, land guaranteed to the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Northern Arapaho under the existing Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851. So the trouble began. The 1851 treaty established boundaries for various Plains tribes and recognized the Powder River country as part of the Lakota domain. In return, the tribes agreed to allow safe passage for settlers and infrastructure such as roads and forts along the Oregon Trail. However, the gold discovery in Montana soon led to violations of these terms. By the 1860s, increasing numbers of miners and settlers traversed the Bozeman Trail, which cut directly through the Lakota hunting grounds, further inflaming tensions. In 1866, the U.S. Army was building forts along this trail. Forts Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith. These were seen as invasions to the natives. Even as new negotiations were taking place at Fort Laramie, a command of soldiers marched from Fort Laramie up the trail to begin construction of Fort Phil Kearny. Chief Redcloud, clearly saying that the talks were not going in good faith, he walked out. Redcloud responded by rallying thousands of warriors from several tribes. Their goal was to shut down the Bozeman Trail and force the U.S. to leave. For 2 years, they waged a guerrilla war using mobility, ambush, and their home field advantage of knowing the terrain. That's what guerrillas do. A disastrous battle for the U.S. came on December 21st, 1866. A detachment of 81 soldiers were sent to relieve a woodcutting party under attack a few miles from Fort Phil Kearny. The post commander, Colonel Carrington, gave orders to the captain in charge of the relief force not to cross Lodge Trail Ridge. The detachment, under the command of Captain Fetterman, were lured over Lodge Trail Ridge in spite of the orders not to proceed farther. It was a trap. The soldiers marched into an ambush. All 81 men were killed. It was the worst defeat on the plains until Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn in 1876. Behind me is Lodge Trail Ridge. That's the ridge that Colonel Carrington didn't want his officers to cross when they were supporting the woodcutter details. But unfortunately, on December 21st, 1866, they did, and the entire 81 person command was wiped out. It's debatable whether Grummond, the lieutenant in charge of the cavalry, was responsible, or Fetterman, the captain in charge of the infantry, was responsible for the initial crossing of the ridge. Historians debate that, but in any case, they both crossed with their commands and all met their fate of death to the natives. The majority of soldiers under Fetterman's command were infantry, and they were armed with the Springfield Model 1861 or 63 rifle muskets from the Civil War, single-shot muzzle-loading percussion rifles, accurate at long range but poorly suited to fast, close-quarters fighting. Slow rate of fire, maybe 2 to 3 rounds per minute if the soldier's been trained. The steps are you'd have to withdraw a paper cartridge from the cartridge box, tear it open with your teeth, expose the powder and ball, pour the black powder down the muzzle, insert the ball, in the case of a Minet-style ball, point up, hollow base down. The paper often went in as a wadding. Draw the ramrod from its channel, ram the ball home to make sure it's seated securely, replace the ramrod, place a percussion cap on the nipple, go to full cock, shoulder the rifle, and now you can fire. It takes a while. Again, at best, maybe 3 shots a minute. There was cavalry there, 27 mounted soldiers in that command. Repeater carbines were carried, the Spencer version of repeater carbines. Also, some of the independent contractors there, a couple of them, had Henry repeaters, which had come out in the 1860, I believe. Lever action, 7-shot tube in the case of the Spencers. Tubular magazine was mounted through the stock of the rifle. Considerably faster rate of fire than the Springfield muskets. Valuable in short-range engagements, but in this case, not enough to shift the outcome due to being caught in an ambush against overwhelming numbers. They were out there, they're exposed, there were just too many of them. Kind of reminds me of the old cliche, when you're up to your ass in alligators, it's hard to remember that your job was to drain the swamp. The tactical advantage of the faster loading breech-fed design was apparent in 2 later battles. By August of 1867, the troops in the area had now been issued the 1866 trapdoors. The hayfield fight, August 1st, and the wagon box fight the next day demonstrated the impact of the new breech-loading rifles. Each fight involved attacks by native warriors on small U.S. detachments protecting hay cutting and wood cutting operations near Forts C.F. Smith and Fort Phil Kearny, respectively. Defensive positions. U.S. troops in both battles used improvised defensive positions, a hay corral at Hayfield, and a circle of wagon boxes at, of course, Wagon Box. Firepower advantage. The defenders in both fights were armed with the newly issued breech loaders. Some contract civilians had repeaters, such as the Spencer and the Henry. All these allowed faster firing and reloading than traditional muzzleloaders. This technological advantage proved crucial. Outcome. In both battles, the defenders repelled vastly superior numbers of attackers, inflicting significant casualties while suffering minimal losses. The often used tactics by the native warriors was to feign a charge and draw the first volley of fire from the muzzleloaders. Once the troopers began to reload, the natives knew they had time to close the gap and attack close in with bows and arrows and melee weapons. Unfortunately for them, the warriors, their strategy failed in these 2 battles. There was no long pause to reload a muzzleloader. The fire was constant from the breech loaders, and the lull of the natives expected never came.
2639, 2639.
As you can see, I got off 3 rounds in a little less than half the time it would have taken a well-trained musket rifleman to fire his 3 rounds. And that was even with a fumbled load on that 3rd round. At the time of making this video, I had no more than maybe a dozen rounds to my trapdoor. It was just some function fire and to get a rough 0. With regular drill, a soldier's loading procedure would become more fluid and even faster. Manpower statistics at Hayfield and Wagenbach's. Hayfield was August 1st, 1867, as we talked about. Defenders were 21 civilians and 9 soldiers. Estimated warrior force of 500 to 800. Lasted several hours, and there were 3 killed. Natives estimated 20 to 50 killed. Wagenbach's, 26 soldiers and 6 civilians. Bit of the reverse ratio. Estimated 800 to 1,000 warriors. Again, several hours, 5 to 6 hours, survivors recounted, and again, 3 killed on the defender side. Estimated warrior deaths were possibly 50 or greater. It mattered that they had continuous fire and were dug in. I don't want to oversell the tactical advantage of the breech loader or the breech loaders alone. Unfortunately, new tech only goes so far. Hubris and poor tactics still have a big part to play. After all, 9 years later, Custer's men had 4570s just like this one at the Little Bighorn. Custer, unfortunately, underestimated the size and fighting capacity of the Lakota and Cheyenne village. He ignored the intelligence of his Crow scouts. They told him the village was bigger than he had wanted to believe. He divided his regiment very aggressively. He assumed that he could swiftly strike and contain the village. He expected the warriors to flee. That didn't happen. The warriors mounted a quick counter-mobilization, as we would call it today. Hundreds of mounted warriors struck Reno's column. Hundreds more maneuvered towards Custer's flank and rear. Experienced leaders like Crazy Horse coordinated multi-directional attacks using close-range, rapid-firing weapons. These are bows and arrows and repeaters. Warriors used terrain features to move in close. Once in, a trained warrior could have multiple arrows in the air at the same time. Although not as common as bows and arrows, repeating rifles were now more prevalent with the natives than they had been in past years. These were usually captured in raids or perhaps purchased in trade someplace. The results eventually gave the warriors a numerical and tactical overmatch. Custer's path back south soon closed. The speed and aggressiveness of the counterattack prevented regrouping and trapped Custer and his men. Well, let's sum all this up. Equipment and skill can play a crucial role in victory. However, without good training, preparation, and sound judgment, victory might still be lost. Keep your wits about you, keep your head on your shoulders, and get training, not just in firearms, first aid, whatever it takes. See your family and yourself through safely. Thanks for watching.